of the land where QUT now stands, pay respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge the important role of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people continue to play within the QUT community. So my next role is to introduce our speaker, Dr. Cole Hunter, who I know very well, and I don't need to read his CV because in a way I was part of creating this CV. I was a co-supervisor of Tom's PhD when his principal supervisors were here at EB. And what I don't remember is how many years ago it was, and I won't count this. But Tom was a very good student, successfully completed his PhD, and then he went off to a very interesting places, first in Barcelona, then in Colorado, and he'll talk a little bit more about this, before coming back here to be supported by a fellowship from the CAR, which is the NHMRC Funded Center for Air Quality, Health and Energy Transitions, as well as support from EB and the Faculty of Science and Engineering. So with this, welcome Tom, and I'm sure Tom will add a little bit more to introducing himself.
Hello. Can you hear that? Yeah. Thank you for the introduction, Lydia. So it's a very cozy audience here at IBI, but this is largely to be part of the CAR seminar series, so streaming online. The presentation will go for about 40 minutes, and then hopefully there's some time for discussion amongst ourselves here physically, but also hopefully we can facilitate questions online for the listeners there. But also this will be recorded and shared if you are not able to stay for the end of the presentation or for some reason lose your connection. So Lydia has introduced me already. I'll just maybe add a few details in that I've kind of gone full circle. So PhD here, actually based in this building, and after that, very fortunate to get a position in Barcelona at what was then called the Center for Research in Environmental Epidemiology. So a few years there working with sustainable transport, health, but also the interplay of physical activity largely, but also some work with microsensors and air quality, which is playing into now the work done with ILAC and CAR. Then after that to Colorado to help coordinate a controlled human exposure study with Cook Stove emissions and health, so still in that area of energy, different energy processes, the emissions from that, and the effects from those emissions on health. So here now back with the Center for Air Quality, Air Pollution, Energy and Health Research, CAR. Okay, so as Lydia mentioned, this is a Center for Research Excellence. It's based at institutions around the country. It's more as a platform to facilitate research than to do research in itself. So it provides, for example, my fellowship, but also seed funding and opportunities for the 30-plus researchers to get together and do work. And part of that focus now is shifting to energy transitions. That's the work we'll talk about today. And then under that theme, 3 sub-themes were identified. The first being ways to reduce the health impacts of wood smoke in Australia, toxicological effects of biodiesel wood and biomass burning, and also potential health impacts of new energy sources. And then maybe for the benefit of CAR, because ILAC is part of IBI here, but it is also part of the Institute for Future Environments. It is a collaborating center with the World Health Organization on research and training since 2004. And 3 main lines of research of ILAC are comprehensive characterization of indoor and outdoor air, including emission sources, integrated health and environmental risk assessments, and strategies for controlling and managing air pollutants. Okay, so an overview of what we'll look at today, essentially 2 parts. The first being how energy processes play with air emissions and health, very briefly on impacts with climate change, and then more of a emphasis on the disease burden of that exposure. And we'll look at a global and a regional context. And then secondly, we'll move to how we're performing the research in that area. So looking at air quality management as a precursor to energy transition. and then we'll introduce the pilot studies we have now in the Pacific Island countries. Okay, so greenhouse gases contribute to climate change. Probably most of us are quite well aware of this. Just to say that combustion emissions are part of these greenhouse gases that are being emitted, notably carbon dioxide. So we have, from early back in history, from large-scale samples, levels of atmospheric carbon dioxide known to be increasing since essentially the Industrial Revolution, when these energy processes were ramping up at a much larger scale. And then those large-scale samples compared with air quality samples taken as a background reading in places like Hawaii. So that greenhouse effect comes from a thickening of the atmosphere, which is where these greenhouse gases come in. They essentially are thickening that blanket, and that's trapping the heat that has come in as solar radiation into the Earth. So less of that heat can escape if that thickening of the gas blanket is occurring. And then there are consequences with the Earth's surface temperature increasing, and this increase in temperature has been correlated with increase of carbon dioxide. This is particularly relevant for the Pacific Island countries that we'll look at today, and it's quite important because these countries are probably one of the lowest contributors to this issue. However, are going to be some of the first who are already experiencing the issues associated with climate change, particularly sea level rise, which is leading to erosion and loss of land around the islands that they live on. And these islands themselves are quite low above sea level. Also affecting productivity with crops, because their crops are typically grown at these points, these lower points, and with an increase in sea level, there's salination of that water table near the coast. Also impacts on economical impacts on the industries associated with the marine environment, be it from fishing or ecotourism. But then more of the focus today is on the health impacts. So criteria air pollutants are also emitted with combustion processes, and this has an impact on disease burden. So carbon monoxide, in particular matter of the two pollutants we'll focus on today, being emitted from combustion processes. And the estimate currently from Global Burden of Disease estimate is showing that outdoor and household air pollution are one of the major contributors to the reason why people are dying younger or are becoming diseased and debilitated because of that exposure. And then we know from health studies that essentially the smaller the size of the particulate matter, the higher toxicity it is, essentially because of the ability to penetrate into the body. And it might not be the particle itself, but the composition of the particle and what could adsorb to it and be brought into the body. So we see that there have been some intervention studies that have shown mixed effects in terms of when you remove that exposure because of by introducing the clean energy transition, then there is some mitigation, but largely that is not occurring, and particularly in the developing countries that are going through the process that we did a few decades ago in terms of economic development. So this was a nice infographic from the WHO tweeted last week, showing that, so they estimate, I believe now, that 7 million people around the world die younger than they should because of air pollution exposure, and this is both household and outdoor sources. The major contributor to that burden is from ischemic heart disease, followed by pneumonia, stroke, COPD, and lung cancer. Now, this burden is not equal across the world, and even within countries, not equal across society. So this figure is quite busy, but the different colors are showing different regions of the world. The black square is the global estimate. You can note that from amongst the colors. But on the left, we have ambient particulate matter pollution, and on the y-axis is the level of exposure as a summary, so increasing exposure as we go up the y-axis. And on the x-axis, we have the sociodemographic index. So it's essentially showing that when it comes to ambient PM pollution, that it's less pronounced, the effect of sociodemographic index on exposure, essentially because it's so pervasive that we can't really escape it. If more and more people move into cities, then you're going to work, you might be living in a cleaner area, but you're working in a less clean area, but also the commute, of course, is a large contributor to that. But then when you move to household air pollution, largely from solid fuels, it's a lot more pronounced, this ratio of sociodemographic index to summer exposure values. So increase in sociodemographic index, largely indicating that there is access to electricity in that household and no need to use solid fuels for energy processes, that this summer exposure value is largely reduced. Okay, so now to the regional focus of all that. And when I say regional, we're talking about the South Pacific island countries. So namely Fiji, Solomon Islands, and now Kiribati being considered. We also have in mind studies for Tonga and Papua New Guinea. But here, our neighbours are the northeast of Australia. So in terms of the situation there with energy, so this is an example with, in the Fijian context, that we have essentially, with this graph is showing with the increasing years that the electricity consumption is increasing. So there's more demand for electricity, so that needs to be addressed by obviously a higher supply. And unfortunately that supply, while before, has been largely hydroelectric. So Fiji, 50% of the grid electricity is fed by hydroelectricity. Fiji is comparable with Papua New Guinea in terms of its geography. It's quite mountainous and you have that potential to tap hydro sources. But essentially that's at capacity. So no more capacity of electricity production can come from hydro, being the main renewable source there. So then that gap instead is being filled by fossil fuel, essentially diesel. You see the increase in that in this brown shade here. Biomass is increasing slightly, but you look at solar and wind, which is the, you can't even note it on the graph here, but essentially it's not considered. So while a lot of electricity is coming from renewable sources, this is only if communities are fortunate enough to be connected to the grid, and because of the geography of the islands, that's not necessarily the case. They might have to rely on a generator to power the community, or if they're lucky enough or fortunate enough, potentially, I guess that's arguable, to be next to a resort, then they can feed into their solar panel array, which they typically have, but otherwise have to rely on biomass for household purposes of producing power. Okay, so when we look at biomass burning, largely it comes down to cooking. So on the left we have a figure of a traditional practice for cooking using biomass. This is equivalent to mahangi in New Zealand. And then on the right, solid fuel cooking inside the home. But this is in communities that are typically outside of the larger cities that don't have access to electricity. But even if you do, again, arguable if it's fortunate or not to be living in a city that has electricity access on a household level. You have problems with the transport system, so buses that are running sulfur-rich diesel, so a grade of diesel that would not be legal in countries like Australia, New Zealand, US, because of that sulfur content. So that's a large problem, the contribution of transport to overall exposure, but also, apologise for the resolution of that image, but generators that are burning this diesel as well to produce electricity. You might find this in the larger communities that have more of a demand for lighting, street lighting. Okay, then this is a study, or findings from a study by Cynthia Iddesleigh, who then was based in Macquarie as a PhD student, Macquarie University as a PhD student. She was one of the first to really study energy and air quality, and also health in this area, in the South Pacific. And from this figure, we see from the pie chart, moving from the top clockwise, so the light grey and dark grey contributions to particulate matter from natural sources, so soil, sea aerosol being namely salt, but a large portion of that, the majority is coming from industrial processes, transport, industry, that are burning this fuel. And so it's important to note that PM2.5 in itself isn't telling as such, so this is a reason, and we'll go into more of that later, that we're also measuring carbon monoxide in these areas besides PM2.5, because PM2.5 can come from completely natural sources. It's just when the source is not natural, it can then come with a lot of other things that are detrimental to health. So then looking at mortality, there was an assessment performed, and they looked at if we removed the sources of this PM, what kind of reduction or mortality risk was there. So this is a figure that's in comparison to mortality risk associated with all fine particulate matter as a percentage. And they also have here Rolto or Fiji in comparison. So, for example, if you completely remove PM2.5 from, black carbon, which is a component of PM2.5 from fossil fuel smoke, then 60%, essentially that burden overall of PM2.5 is reduced. So really showing, depends on the source, there is a different impact on health and the health burden from that. Okay, so then how do we go in there and collect more data to enable this transition? We'll look at the methods to augment that evidence, and then introduce the pilot studies that we're doing there. Okay, so the low-cost sensor program, this was all kicked off by an ARC linkage project grant from 2016. And the title of that was Developing and Utilizing Advanced Networks for Air Quality Sensing and Analysis. So why use low-cost sensors? Essentially to better understand and quantify spatial variation and pollutant concentrations at a city block scale. So traditionally we have regulatory monitors that are based at certain points around the city, producing very accurate information about exposure at that point. But then throughout the city it's very hard to extrapolate to the wider population. So with these low-cost sensors, you can get more of them out and therefore get more information spatially as to how air quality is around an area. There's other ways to do that, such as using satellite measurements or modeling, such as based on land use features. But again, these are models, so therefore they're estimated and not there on the ground reading actual concentrations of these pollutants. There's a lot of assumptions that need to be put into those models. Source contribution, so if you have enough resources to put sensors inside and outside, you can tell then where are the sources. Are they outside the home or are they inside the home? So as before we mentioned that household air pollution was a major concern because the process is happening in the home, but then how do you pull apart that from what's happening outside? It could be biomass burning occurring outside, or it could be from industry nearby. But if you know the difference or compare the concentrations indoor and outdoor, you can get an idea of where the actual source is. But also for reasons of regulation, so personal exposure, that might be more on an industrial level, that certain industries might need to regulate the exposure of their workers, but also to address community queries. So now citizen science is really being boosted because of these low-cost sensors. The fact that you don't need a large grant from the government to get more expensive instruments, the instruments that are lower cost are starting to get to a quality in which they are providing reliable and useful information. Okay, so the sensors are really just the start of it. So this is kind of a map of what the ARC linkage project is doing. So the monitor is produced, it's being characterized and optimized inside the lab, but also in field testing. And then looking at the data, trying to interpret essentially how realistic is it, are there certain factors we need to consider, such as humidity, to apply correction factors, or simply because of the nature of the electronics that they're known to perform in a certain way and certain adjustments need to be made to give the actual value. But then a place to receive the data coming from these sensors. So you could have a very large number of these sensors because of the low cost. So then it's quite an overwhelming task. For example, for one individual to manage that. So instead of you have it automated, that there's a management center online, then things are a lot more automated and easier to control. And have an overview for a manager to see how these sensors or monitors are performing. Then it comes to this fourth part in which the monitors need to put out an actual network. So the whole purpose of that activity. And then starting to use the data collected from that network in part 5 to interpret and apply to different scenarios. So for example, the Gold Coast, this was the first, I guess, end-to-end trial of this system in which you're familiar, they put out a number of these sensors around the Gold Coast, Commonwealth Games area to track air quality there. As a pilot to see how the system worked. And the idea is that then linking air quality to athletic performance. As we know from previous studies, that can be the case, such as lung function can be reduced with even acute exposures to certain air pollutants at certain levels. Okay, so the sensor itself, looking at the hardware. So it's called a koala, and this is an acronym for Knowing Our Ambient Local Air. I think this was something from a master's student, but it's actually been quite well received. I think that we had a visit from the World Health Organization Western Pacific Regional Office Director General that just started this year. He was quite fond of the name, actually. That was quite impactful for him. So it's nice to have this thing that's, especially when you're talking about citizen science or something that is with a child for 24 hours, to measure their exposure profile, but something that's a bit more relatable, having that name. But anyway, so it's measuring fine particulate matter, PM2.5, particles that are considered respirable, so it can get deeper down into the lungs, and carbon monoxide. Two markers from combustion, carbon monoxide being more of an ideal marker. So the two together can tell you what the source of the PM really is. Is it coming from natural processes such as sea aerosols, or is it coming from combustion processes such as burning biomass? And these are two pollutants that are regulated typically by governments because of the known health consequences. As you see this koala here, this is mounted, but they can also be worn, so we will soon start trialing child monitoring in Suva, Fiji. And I'll go into that more later. But essentially it's portable. It's kind of as small as we can get it with it still being reliable and providing useful information. And it's been a similar thing has been used in previous studies, and it's probably not going to be a burden, but it can be worn, and if it is worn, then it's essentially with a rechargeable battery that every 18 hours will be recharged. If it's mounted, then it can be fitted with a solar panel, and that will then just power itself. Assuming that in the 4 days it gets some sunlight, it will maintain sufficient battery charge. So, so far we've seen that to be more than enough capacity to be self-sustained. So it's nice, it's not actually needing to be plugged into mains power to operate. And keeping it wireless, communication is done with these fixed sensors via GPRS, so the same way that your telephone communicates with the network to transfer data. This koalas are fitted with a SIM card and with a modem of transferring that data. And we'll see the data management center soon, but that's what it's communicating with. But if it is a personal sensor to save battery life, then USB transfer is preferred. So at the end of the day, the data can be put off an SD card, or the SD card can be taken out and put into a computer that will receive it to pull the data from that file. Having said that, we have units now that will use GPRS and portable devices. It's just a matter of what is your scenario for deployment. Do you want a longer battery life, or is shorter okay? So when we say low cost, currently I think it's estimated to be well below 1,000 per unit, and this includes labor to construct that. So you compare that to what you might consider more benchmark instruments, larger instruments that might provide more accurate or more trusted in the scientific community. They would be up in potentially the tens of thousands of dollar mark. So you can see still getting reliable data with these low-cost sensors and having more spatially useful information, that there's a real application for these low-cost sensors. So some of the field work that's been done comparing to the benchmark instruments. So here we have a koala against what's called a TIOM, which is essentially just a gold standard reference instrument for fine particulate matter, just showing the trace. There are some limitations, but essentially it's definitely following the pattern that you see with the red dots here being the koala and the solid line being of the TIOM, the gold standard reference there. This is over a 24-hour period. And then looking at carbon monoxide, so this is a gas sensor from a group in the UK called AlphaSense. And again, comparing the solid line being the gold standard reference for carbon monoxide, and then the koala measurements compared to that. So it's tracking quite nicely. To show the faces behind the team, so Lydia, Professor Lydia Morawska, the director of ILAC, is leading this team, but we also have important contributions from the master's student on the right here, Tara King, who was the one to come up with the acronym. I think largely was doing the field work at the Gold Coast. We have Fong Tai, who's now at UQ, and Rohan Jayarapni, second from the right, who are the senior research fellows that really help with the interpretation of data. Bryce Christensen here, who is the essentially communications engineer that is really helping to set up these systems in other countries and relying on that data to get to us. Okay, I won't go into detail of these projects, but just to say that there's a lot of projects now picking up these lower cost sensors to work with. I mentioned before the Gold Coast Commonwealth Games, that was really the start of it. We also now have koalas installed down in the Port of Melbourne, and this was a community-driven project in that they had complaints, they reached out to have air quality monitoring being performed, and this is because they live in an apartment that is close proximity to the port there. So the port that's stocking large ships and the emissions that come with that. Other notable projects I'm more familiar with are those internationally. So Super Fiji, we'll talk about. Candy Sri Lanka, I think, has just started their network. And then Solomon Islands, we hope in the next couple of weeks, depending on getting the official invitation because of elections happening at the same time. We've been told the Australian Army has been invited, but we're yet to get our invitation, so we're hoping to get that soon and get the network there started. And also towards the middle of the year in Kiribati, and then ours as well on Tonga and Papua New Guinea to start piloting networks there. Okay, so the data management center has been introduced. I'll just go into a little bit more detail of that. So the center, this is essentially the first page that you will see. And from this, it's giving you an overview of the sensors. So you see at the top a list of numbers, and then you see different facets of those numbers. AQB027 is one individual koala. And what you see is a location of where it's been deployed. You see the voltage, so this is the voltage of the battery. This lets you monitor the efficacy of the solar panel that is being positioned in the place that is allowing it to get enough charge to continue running. You see when the last communication was and the last sensor reading was. So the sensor might read a frequency of 5 minutes, and then every 30 minutes, to say battery, it will then open up a connection with the cellular network and send that data off. So it's kind of a diagnostic tool to know where the koalas are, the low-cost instruments, and just make sure that they're operating as intended. But you can go into more detail with that. So as well as the pollutants, you can look at the battery health in more detail to see, I guess, diurnally or temporally how the voltage of the battery is performing in response to the input from solar voltage. So you see here, essentially, as the sunlight comes out, this is the peak in the green line, which is solar voltage, and then that kind of pattern following to its capacity of the battery, this black line, as we go along in time across multiple days. Okay, so now to introduce the pilots that we're doing in the Pacific Island countries, the ones that have been well established. So there's 2 current pilot projects, and CARA is playing a major role in this by providing seed funding. The first being in Fiji, and the title of this pilot study was The Assessment of Children's Exposure to Air Pollution in Fiji, Its Drivers, the Burden of Disease attributable to it, and how transition to clean energy would mitigate it. Secondly, in the Solomon Islands, which you hope will kick off soon, on the ground, is removing cultural barriers against transition to clean cooking methods in the Solomon Islands. So 2 different things there. In Fiji, it's about getting a network running to get a baseline level of air quality in the region, to then, when we get to a point of working more closely with the stakeholders there, local government, to really be able to track what's happening with clean energy interventions, for example. What's the point of replacing buses, like electrical or hybrid buses, rather than the diesel buses that are currently there. However, in the Solomon Islands, the problem is quite well known in the community there and at the government level. It's just at the household level, there is resistance to that change. I mean, it's very well to go to someone and say, this is a better way of doing things for different reasons, but obviously it's not so easy for them to, for anyone to change habits. For example, there's places in Australia where people continue to burn solar fuels in their fireplace because they enjoy the smell or just the crackling of the wood or the glow. They have access to electric heaters. There's no reason for it, but there's just some sentimental or kind of traditional basis for this preference of cooking, for example. So overall, the aims of going over to this region are to build the local networks, to get an idea of air quality, because these networks don't yet exist. They don't have monitoring stations for being able to regulate pollution, because you can't manage what you don't measure. And then to start assessing the sources of exposure. This will come with the portable koalas that we'll have with school children in Fiji in the coming month, hopefully. So they'll take up to 24 hours. We'll go into detail that soon, but that'll give us an idea of sources and exposures, and then ultimately to eliminate air pollution and to clean energy. So I think it's all spawned from a meeting in Manila with the WHO that Lydia attended, and they came up with this goal of essentially eliminating childhood mortality in the region by 2030. So this is starting to build some evidence, and we'll work towards that. Okay, so partners involved. Essentially, there's a new consortium that's been established across what you might call it Oceania, including Australia and these islands in South Pacific. So very importantly, we have regional universities involved. So Fiji National University, as well as the University of the South Pacific. We have local partners in terms of academic institutions. We have University of Queensland, we have University of Sydney. We also have a University of Oxford partner that is going to come in with what you might consider more of a benchmark instrument, but only for the purpose of tracking kind of longer distance transportation of pollutants. But the idea is to have our lower cost sensors to be running side by side for a period to get comparable data, of course, EV, and of course car. But then importantly also government and non-government organisations being involved. So currently on paper we have the Fijian government and the Solomon Islands government, but also endorsements from the Asian Development Bank, UNICEF and the World Health Organization. These endorsements are coming from discussions and interest to essentially write proposals together to using the funds provided by SECAR to pilot these networks, to then be able to expand the networks and be a bit more ambitious with the resources that we hopefully can get together, again for this purpose of reducing childhood mortality in the region. To put some faces to that, this was at the kickoff meeting in Suva, Fiji, which we had a number of stakeholders involved. It was kind of to introduce the project, but also to talk in general about air quality, that link to energy and health. So it's one thing to build a network, but a nice byproduct of that is that there's also a bit of capacity in using that information to be able to make decisions that would benefit health, as an example. So we have Nisir Hussain from the Regional Office of the WHO, Dip Chan is the head of the Ministry of Health in Fiji, Professor Emilia Dragavecci from Fiji National University, Audrey Gals, who's affiliated with the same university but also UQ, Andrew Danzy from University of Oxford, and others. So while we're there as well, of course, because we couldn't be there, unfortunately, all the time on the ground working with these sensors, to be able to show the people that would be doing that how the instruments work, and the design is purposely made to be user-friendly, so little kind of things to do as possible, but still, it's easy when you know how to do it, but it's just a case of showing how things are working. So this is just an example of that type of meeting. And then having the local partners on the ground actually going out and dealing with the sensors. So we might identify issues, but then we have to ask them to kind of go out and check on that. So yeah, it's been quite fun to collaborate in that way. So this is an example of the koalas that have been distributed out into Suva, Fiji. I believe this is at the the meteorological station at Sugar Point. So we saw the data management center before with the facets of the different sensors and their status, but you can also see in real time the information coming from that on a map, so geographically. I mentioned before with those photos that the meteorological station at Sugar Point is where we have one of the koalas, and that's this point here. We also have, this was a few months earlier when we first started rolling them out, that we have 2 different campuses in the university. We now have one moved to a market area that is also the main bus depot of the city, and one has been moved to a community a little further out where there was a complaint of air quality. But just to give you an idea of the data that we're getting in and starting to clean and analyze. So this is the biggest producer in R, and this is on the top carbon monoxide, the y-axis, and then fine particulate matter in the bottom here. The bold line is the mean, and these are currently hourly means across a day. So first days of the week, Monday to Sunday, and then 24 hours within each day is each facet. The bold line being the hourly average across that day, and this is an aggregate of the months of data that we have so far. So this is just to give an idea of the temporal trend where these sensors are. There's carbon monoxide, and then to be able to interpret then the source, we have here fine particulate matter as well. So what we now are in discussions with the local partners to kind of try to interpret local sources and why we might be seeing these patterns. They're a little atypical to what you would see in maybe a larger city, but we still do see on most days this peak in the morning, which peak would be associated with peak traffic. But we don't necessarily see in the afternoon, and we don't see on Sunday, as we would have expected, that there would be kind of more of a plateau in terms of air quality because of just the locally Sundays is left for rest and other duties rather than work and industrial activity. So of course people could still be using transport, but yeah, that discussion is ongoing to work out what is happening there. It could be that just with more months of data being collected, we start to see it smooth out more, and there's less deviation, which you see with the shaded areas around that mean. That's still to be determined. It's not necessarily any easier than to look at that as a daily average, so these are across the days of the week. And again, this is just the one point at Super Point, which is meant to be background. The levels are considered to be background, and that they're not exceeding any regulatory limits set by the World Health Organization, but still we see differences throughout the day which are interesting. If you have any ideas as to why that might be, we would be interested to hear, but we're still working on that. And I mentioned before that one of the koalas was taken out to a community, kind of ad lib in a way, that concern was identified and an opportunity to go out and capture what was happening because of complaints from a community. So there was some industrial activity happening down here, and there was complaints essentially within a child that respiratory complaints were anecdotally being tied to activity down here. So they were interested to get one of our monitors there to try to track or have some kind of hard evidence in a way that these kind of peaks in evolution are occurring for them to match up with when activity down there is occurring. But it was just a nice way to get a bit more involvement with the community and have a bit more direction from the local partners as to where they want to place it, because up until now we've been a bit maybe narrow in thinking that we wanted a weather station because that's important to get weather data to interpret the air quality information, and certain areas where we think might be interesting, but really it should be down to the the people that are there to decide what is most important and interesting to monitor. Okay, so I mentioned before, this is myself, not a child, but I mentioned before that the next component of monitoring will be with children. So the monitor there, this is before we changed the 3D printing casing of the monitor, so now it can be on the backpack that is closer to the breathing zone to get a better idea of exposure. And then that will be coupled with the time activity diary, because while we do have a GPS receiver in there, often if you go into houses, it's not always a great signal, so to verify where people are and to be able to compare different microenvironments in terms of air quality, then we can then verify with this time activity diary. So essentially people just know different activities that they're doing, the times of that, and we'll have a research system there on the ground that will interact with the children obviously to get informed consent with themselves and their parents, but also to run down equipment, how it works, but then also to check that these time activities are coming back completed, because often in these studies, time activity diaries are not always well completed, and when it comes to following up, when you're looking at the data months later, of course people forget what they're doing, so I think it's important to capture that straight after when people have finished the 24-hour monitoring period, which they'll have. Okay, getting towards the end, so just one interesting example is while we're over in Suva kicking off the project, that the World Health Organization office space there in Suva had complaints respiratory systems there, so they were interested to borrow one of these sensors to track air quality. What we saw from that, this is from one day, and this is with particulate matter on the y-axis on the left, carbon monoxide on the right. We'll see the events that come. I'm not sure if you can guess from that, but it's really quite evident what happens when we get into the office of the World Health Organization. So we have where we were staying in the resort at the very beginning of the day, out by the bay, and then we had a little bit of time to kill, so we walked around the CBD here around between 10 and 11 o'clock. So you really see these peaks in PM2.5 and CO, and this would be largely from the exhaust of the traffic that we are walking amongst. Once we step into the office, it really plateaus. I think this point here is when we went to get lunch. But then again, stepping out back into the streets, these real peaks in CO and PM2.5. And then we moved to a campus that was higher up in the hills outside the city, and again we get this kind of background level similar to what we saw in the resort, our accommodation. So from that we interpreted it as not being involved in combustion emissions, because like the comparison, but then potentially could be something due to mold, just from observations that there was markers of that, and so I think the spin-off studies come to try to monitor bioaerosols there to answer that question. And just another pilot of, or example of what the portable monitors can show coupled with the time activity diaries. So this is just an example of one of the research assistants taking one, I think this was on a Saturday. So you see with bus travel, different times per day, market attendance in the cinema and home. So I guess the notable events are particularly this bus travel, these real peaks here. And it's interesting then to compare to the bus travel in the morning. The buses there typically don't have closed windows, they have open spaces and might have a soft plastic to roll down to keep out rain. So I think this is really a factor of where someone might be sitting on the bus. So if they're sitting at the back, it might be closer to the exhaust that is coming into the cabin, but not necessarily staying in, therefore is also found at the front of the cabin. But it kind of makes me think that we need to push for more detail with some of these activities. And then just interestingly, at the time that dinner was noted, we have this peak here in PM2.5 but not carbon monoxide, which makes me think that this person has an electric stove, but these part because of the lack of combustion marker of CO, but then the increase in particulate matter, which could be from just heated oil aerosolizing and therefore being measured by the quality. Okay. We have now the prototype for, this is kind of the second prototype rendition of what you see here. This is the very, very first trial of essentially the visual display. So, and I'll have this outside for you to look at if you like, but essentially that data that you saw plotted in real time, it'll be shown here. And the point of this is for the health promotion officers of the Ministry of Health there to attend households to show what's happening to air quality when they're, for example, cooking. What happens when they have an alternative, be it a clean cooker, and there has been an intervention study that was performed with clean cookers that wasn't taken up. So we think that we really need to bring the point home that there is that link between that increased air pollution, the risk to children to getting sick, and that can be mitigated by use of this cleaner appliance. And then, of course, it's one thing to put that in, but then to revisit and see if there was any change in behaviour with that that demonstration. So we're meant to be there on 2nd of April to have that workshop, but of course we're still waiting for the clearance to be able to get into the country. And it's supported in the Solomon Islands because, like other countries, it's not too dissimilar that 90% of the households don't have access to electricity. They're using solid fuel. And with that, they have attributed 45% of all the lower respiratory tract infections to that exposure. And then 14% of those mortalities due to infection because of household air pollution or emissions from solid fuel combustion. And importantly, these figures are higher than global averages, so this is a real problem in the Solomon Islands. And just to briefly mention that there are some nice local social enterprises that are getting into this area of that clean cooking or clean energy alternative. We have Powerwells, which is actually based in Brisbane, and they're using laptop batteries to be repurposed as basically like a mini Powerwall that Tesla is rolling out in different parts of the country. So throughout the day, you might have a panel that's recharging this battery, and at night you can bring it in, you can connect it to your lights, your mobile phone, whatever electrical appliance they might be that would improve the quality of life for these people. And then a bit more simply, this started in Nepal, but it is an Australian enterprise introduction of these solar lights, because Solomon Islands, for example, has a heavy reliance in households with electricity, heavy reliance on kerosene lanterns, which of course are emitting all kinds of pollutants that are not good for us. Okay, so just to finish that, we're looking forward to Kiribati later in the year. It'll be a really interesting place because you're probably aware that this is going to be one of the first islands to really, I guess, lose its way of life because of sea level rise as a consequence of climate change. So really interesting to see what we can do there. So looking forward to that. So just in summary, 3 points you take away from today. I guess I'd be happy that traditional energy practices, essentially combustion processes, emit fine particulate matter and CO. But we can gather evidence on those pollutants by using low-cost air quality monitors. And using that evidence, we can hopefully guide changes in policy and behaviour in the developing countries using these low-cost sensors. So yeah, if you have any questions, that's my email address there. If you'd like to follow up, yes, particularly for those online, I'd just like to thank Kara and Evie again for putting on this talk. Hopefully it was interesting. And yeah, I guess we have a few minutes now to have any questions. I'm not sure if we need to check with Marge if there's how we do that. Zoom?
I'll do that.
Okay. So while we're waiting, we can pass around this. That's running currently. Definitely open to feedback. I think there's ways to improve that. The idea is to take a prototype. We can only kind of guess so much that we think would be useful, but then we take it in a completely different context. That what we think would be useful isn't actually going to be informative in different parts of the world. So the idea is to take that prototype to this workshop in Solomon Islands and get feedback from them there and present it and present the idea of what we want to do, and then get their opinion as to how that will work, would it work, and take that and then try to improve if necessary before rolling out to the communities with the health promotion officers.
Doesn't seem to be any questions.
No.
Questions with you?
I guess it means it was very clearly explained.
Oh, hold on. Michael has got a question.
Michael? Do they have a microphone there, or is he going to type it? Might have been just stretching. Q&A box. Is there a Q&A box somewhere?
Yeah.
Ah.
Oh, you can't see
We
it.
said question typed in Q&A box.
He raised his hand.
Hmm.
It's all so exciting. We could probably share the email address of yours.
Yeah, sure. Yep.
And people could follow up with
Yeah.
questions.
Mm-hmm. Yep, we're happy for that.
Yeah. Nothing from the audience? Yay, we've got one. Awesome. We'll just get you to talk into the mic for the benefit of the recording.
So the time series of the personal monitoring
Yep.
for 1 day, can you show that?
If you can bring that back. For,
For the personal.
yep. Which one was that? This one?
Next one?
Next one. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, just take it off, please.
What the peak in the bus time, in the market attendance of the PM 2.5, do you think?
Down here, about
Yeah.
the 10 o'clock.
During the market attendance?
I'm not sure, it's a good question. The time activity diary had only given essentially for that block of time. So again, just need to get some more detailed information. I don't know if we can expect that from participants, but I guess the more important thing maybe is that as a overall exposure at that place in the market, there is that peak there, but I guess overall it is.
Yeah,
it is
because
low, and maybe that's-
you can see the peak in PM 2.5, but you can't see the peak in CO.
but not CO.
Yeah, but I think maybe you can exclude the big peak of the CO, and then you have a look at the
More refined.
the
that's a
CO
good idea.
trend. Maybe
You
you
think
can
you
see more
might then
trend.
see, right, because CO we wouldn't see typically much higher than.
Yeah, because
three.
the range is too big. You can't see the peak in CO.
Yeah, that's a good idea. That could tell us a little more, although looking at the rest, yeah, that's something I can look into. Imagine being at a market, could be all kinds of wonderful things happening, but yeah, so there is GPS data collected for this as well. So it could be a matter of actually looking where this monitor was being moved to. But again, within the market, it could be, I guess, quite complicated to know all the different wonderful things happening there. Could be some kind of substance being sold, spices, whatever. But that's interesting, yeah. But yeah, I can look into that.
What age range of students are you looking to recruit for the
Yeah,
project?
it's important detail that I left out, but essentially 10 to 15-year-old children. For the fact that they will be a bit more independent to be able to, I guess, look after the koala, but also because of the size, it's probably something that an older child will be more comfortable with and less hindered by, but also still being school children, still developing. It's still an important period of the life frame to capture exposures of 10 to 15-year-old. That would be for a 24-hour period. So essentially they'll be met at school around lunchtime, say. They'll take that on their commute home or wherever they might go in the afternoon for sports or play, and then overnight in their household, and then back the next morning for the morning commute. In general, right now.
Why not over a week? Why just for 24-hour period?
It's a good question. To us, it's more important to get more people monitored rather than the same person monitored, because they're going to have a pretty similar pattern, at least through a school week, going to and from school by the same commute mode. The weekends will be different, but it's also a matter of, I guess, compliance, because I guess after a while it starts to become potentially a bit of a burden. What was your experience with Uptech? Was it that?
We did several similar studies, not with Koala, but with another instrument for ultrafine particle monitoring, which was of a similar size. And the initial idea was that kids would be wearing them for a week. And here in Brisbane, we were talking about kids 8 to 11 years old.
Yes,
in different places and countries, the kids were a bit older. But a week wearing this would be a too big burden for the kids. That's why we thought that 24 hours is something where we could get reasonably good compliance, and it worked since it worked in other studies. So this is the reason that this is the period.
We've had a question come in from the online audience, from Michael Abramson. So he says Steve Gordon's group did a randomized controlled trial of clean cook stoves in Malawi, which didn't show any of the expected benefits. How can you avoid the same problem in the Solomon Islands? So I think some of the issues with these intervention studies is that they bring in, again, as mentioned before, it's one thing to introduce a new way of doing things, but to actually adhere to it when you might prefer the traditional way, you're more comfortable with it, you might be more nostalgic. It's, I guess, adherence is a problem, but also I think something they call double stacking, where they might use this new clean energy appliance via the stove and then also cook with another one, so they're not actually reducing exposure, they might be just actually adding if the other one is just cleaner, still combusting but cleaner rather than electric. So how can we avoid that in the Solomon Islands? Well, I guess the thing is that we're not yet looking at the health outcomes, it's going to be more looking at air quality. So we have the health promotion officers that are visiting these households to observe what the current situation is. Have this demonstration with the Koala, the clean energy appliance, and also information material, probably a video produced with the local partners there, so it's relevant. And then I think the idea is that, because it's part of their rounds anyway, they're visiting these households as part of their rounds, they'll then make another observation as to how the situation is. So it's not so much trying to improve health outcomes directly now, it's a matter of improving conditions of air quality because of these energy processes, and then the health benefits will come with that, if that makes sense. Yeah.
This is true that many of such programs were unsuccessful, and one of the big reasons was that the stoves were brought in a way from outside by the researchers or organizations who designed the stoves, and the idea they brought the stoves to the communities. But in fact, the community didn't own up to this. So after a while the stoves started presenting problems, they were abandoned. What we are not trying to do anything like this whatsoever. Our work will be not only together, but we will just encourage and influence the locals to come up with their own ideas. There are already quite a number of different approaches being used there in terms of clean energy for cooking, which already create some problems, as we've learned, in terms of e-waste. So something works, something doesn't work. But we were working with the colleagues from the Solomon Islands initially. We will them to get to work out what are the reasons, how they want to make it happen, and not as telling them what to do. So I think, and I hope that this will be the way to avoid problems of the previous programs.
Yeah.
Well, in this case, it's my pleasure to thank you, Tom, for a good presentation and for being a very good postdoc who carries this program patiently with daily many emails with our colleagues, both from Suva and now from the Solomon Islands, to make this happen. So thank you, Tom.